The morning her father was buried, Evelyn Turner counted exactly 7 men who had promised to help carry the coffin, and only one of them actually showed up. Dry Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, was not a town known for its kindness. It sat squat and sun-bleached along the western edge of a dying river, the kind of place where dust settled into everything, into the furniture, into the curtains, into the lungs of the people who stayed too long. The town had a saloon, a general store, a livery, a church with a leaning steeple, and a graveyard at the edge of it all that kept growing no matter how many people left. It was the sort of town where men made promises the way they drank whiskey freely and without consequence, and where women learned to expect very little and be grateful for even less. Evelyn Turner was 26 years old, and she had learned that lesson better than most. Her father, Thomas Turner, had not been a rich man. He had been a stubborn, proud, sun-worn rancher who had worked his land from before sunup to well after dark every single day of his life, and he had expected everyone around him to do the same. He had not been a warm man, not in the way that fathers in books were warm, but he had been honest, and he had never raised his hand to his family, and in Dry Creek, that passed for decent. He had died of a fever that had started as a cough and ended, 10 days later, in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, with Evelyn holding his hand and watching the lamplight play across his still face. She had sent word to the neighboring ranches, to the men he had shared fences and water rights with for 20 years. She had received condolences in the form of nodded heads and murmured words, and 7 separate promises that, yes, of course, they would come and help carry Thomas Turner to his resting place. It was the least they could do. On the morning of the funeral, with the coffin resting on sawhorses in front of the little church, and with the reverend waiting inside and the congregation already seated in uncomfortable wooden pews, Evelyn stood in the cool spring air and watched the road leading into town. Her mother, Clara Turner, sat inside with Evelyn's younger sister, Nora, who was 22 and had her mother's pale fragility and none of her father's stubbornness. The two of them were already weeping quietly, surrounded by the women of the town who had come bearing food and sympathy. But the road was empty. Not a single one of the 7 men who had promised to come had arrived to fulfill that promise. Evelyn stood very straight in her black dress, which was the only black dress she owned, a wool thing that was too heavy for the warming season and too plain for even the modest standards of their community. She did not cry. She had been doing her crying in the dark, in private, the way her father had taught her to do everything difficult. In public, you held yourself together. In public, you did what needed doing. But she did not know how 4 women herself, her mother, Nora, and Mrs. Aldridge, the Reverend's wife, were going to lift a full-grown man in a pine box and carry him the 40 yards to the prepared grave without help. And the thought of asking the Reverend himself, who was 70 years old and barely able to climb his own pulpit steps, made her chest tighten with something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but lived somewhere between the two. She was still staring at the road when she heard boots on the dry earth behind her. She turned, and that was when she saw him. He was tall not in a showy way, but in the way of a man who had simply grown into all of himself, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples beneath a battered brown hat, and the kind of sun-darkened complexion that came from years of working outdoors. He wore a clean shirt, dark trousers, and boots that had been polished. She could see, with some care, though they were still scuffed at the toes from hard use. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two more, with a jaw that held a shadow of stubble and dark eyes that moved over the scene with the quick, quiet assessment of a man who was used to reading situations and acting without being asked. He had come from the direction of the livery, which meant he had tied his horse and walked up the main street, and he had done it without fanfare, without the self-important clearing of throat that most men used when they wanted to be noticed for doing something decent. He looked at the coffin. He looked at the sawhorses. He looked at Evelyn. "You need hands," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not carry unnecessary weight. It was a practical voice, a working voice. Evelyn blinked. "The service hasn't started yet," she said, because she could think of nothing else to say. "I know," he said simply. "But that coffin needs carrying, and it doesn't look like there are many here to carry it." She opened her mouth, closed it. She was not a woman given to shows of gratitude, not because she was ungrateful, but because she had been raised to keep herself composed, and composure, right now, was the only thing standing between her and the kind of weeping she refused to do in public. She looked at this stranger, for he was a stranger, she was certain of it. She knew most of the faces in Dry Creek, and this was not among them, and she felt something shift in her chest, something subtle and not entirely comfortable. "Yes," she said, "we do need hands." He nodded. "Tell me what you need." His name, she learned later, after the service, after the coffin had been carried and lowered into the red Texas earth with the stranger at one corner, and 3 other men who had quietly joined, once they saw him step forward, was Ezekiel Blackwell. He was a cowboy by trade, though that word covered a great deal of territory. He had ridden for cattle drives up from San Antonio, had worked as a ranch hand in 3 different counties, and had arrived in Dry Creek 2 days prior looking for a job posted on the board outside the general store, a position on the Holden Ranch east of town. He had not known Thomas Turner. He had not known the Turner family at all. He had simply ridden past the church on his way to inquire about the job, seen the coffin and the empty road, and a woman standing very straight with her hands clasped in front of her and her jaw set in the particular way of someone who was holding themselves together with everything they had. And he had made a decision without thinking about it particularly deeply, because it had seemed like the only decent thing to do. That was the thing about Ezekiel Blackwell that Evelyn would come to understand only gradually. He did not make a show of his decency. He simply practiced it, the way other men practiced cards or drinking, because it came naturally to him, and because he saw no reason not to. After the burial, when the congregation had dispersed, and the food that the women of the town had brought was being set out in the Turner home, Evelyn found him standing at the fence at the edge of the graveyard, looking out at the flat stretch of land beyond it. He had his hat in his hands, which she noticed because most men kept their hats on when they were waiting for something, and a man who held his hat in his hands was usually waiting to leave. "I haven't thanked you properly," she said. He turned. Up close she could see that his eyes were a very dark brown, almost black, and they had a steadiness to them that she found, to her mild irritation, a little difficult to look away from. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "Nevertheless," she said, "I am thanking you. My name is Evelyn Turner. Thomas was my father." He dipped his head. "Ezekiel Blackwell, I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Turner." "It's the first time I've heard those words and believed them," she said before she could stop herself, and then felt the heat rise in her face because that was far more honest than she intended to be with a stranger. He did not look amused by her embarrassment, which she appreciated. He simply looked at her with that steady gaze and said, "People say them when they don't know what else to say. That doesn't always mean they don't mean them." "Do you mean them?" she asked. "I don't know your father," he said, "but I can see that his loss was real, so yes, I mean it." She looked at him for a moment. The spring sun was warm on her shoulders, and the dry grass beyond the fence moved gently in the breeze, and somewhere in the direction of the church, a mockingbird was working through its repertoire with focused determination. "Will you come in?" she said. "There's food." He hesitated, and she could see him calculating the awkwardness of walking into a dead man's house as an uninvited stranger against the impulse of a man who didn't want to be rude. "If you're sure," he said. "I'm asking," she said. "That means I'm sure." He came in. The Turner house was a modest frame structure with a front room that served as parlor and dining room combined, a kitchen that Evelyn had spent most of her life in, and 2 small bedrooms in the back. It smelled of beeswax and coffee, and the dried herbs that her mother hung in bundles from the kitchen rafters. On the day of the funeral, it smelled also of the various dishes that the women of the congregation had brought: cornbread and stewed chicken, and a pie that Mrs. Hollies had made with the last of her put-up peaches. Clara Turner was sitting in the chair that had always been her husband's chair, which she had not sat in before, and which she seemed to have chosen deliberately, as if claiming it were a way of acknowledging that the world had changed, and she intended to meet that change head-on. She was a small woman, fine-boned and fair-haired, and she had the look of someone who had been crying for some time but had made herself stop. When Ezekiel walked in beside Evelyn, she looked at him with the sharp, measuring eyes that Evelyn had inherited. "Mama," Evelyn said, "this is Mr. Blackwell. He helped today." Clara Turner looked at him for a moment, and then something in her face softened. "Sit down, Mr. Blackwell," she said. "Please." He sat, and Nora brought him a plate without being asked, which was unusual for Nora, who was generally absorbed in her own considerable inner weather. But she set the plate down in front of him with a quiet thank you directed at him, and he said, "You're welcome," in a way that suggested he understood what it was she was actually thanking him for. He ate without rushing, and he listened more than he spoke, which Evelyn noted because most men she knew did the opposite. When he did speak, he answered questions directly and without embellishment. He had come from San Antonio. He was looking for steady work. He had been on the road for about 3 weeks. "The Holden Ranch," Clara said thoughtfully. "That's a good position if Bill Holden takes a liking to you." "I hope he will," Ezekiel said. "I'm a fair hand with cattle and I can fix most things that break." "Can you fix a fence line?" Clara asked. Evelyn looked at her mother because she could hear the particular quality of a practical mind working behind the question. "Yes, ma'am. We have a fence line along the north pasture that my husband was meaning to repair before he took ill," Clara said. "We have cattle of our own, not many, 12 head, but they've been wandering through a gap in that fence, and I don't have the hands to deal with it. I was going to ask the Holden boys to come by, but they've got their own concerns." Ezekiel set down his fork and looked at Clara with the same steady attention he gave everything. "I could take a look at it," he said. "Tomorrow, if you like, before I go see Holden." Clara nodded as if this were perfectly natural and not at all the remarkable thing it was. "I would appreciate that." Evelyn watched this exchange and felt again that uncomfortable shift in her chest. She was not a woman who trusted quickly. She had seen too many men make promises in this town, promises that dissolved like morning frost by midday. But there was something about the way Ezekiel Blackwell moved through the world, without noise, without performance, that made her want to believe he was different, which made her want to be careful, because wanting to believe something was exactly the kind of thing that led to being disappointed. She told herself this firmly, and then spent the rest of the evening acutely aware of where he was sitting in the room. He came back the next morning, as he had said he would. Evelyn was already up, as she always was before anyone else, feeding the chickens and drawing water from the well, when she heard the sound of a horse on the road and looked up to see him dismounting at the gate. He tied his horse and walked up the path with his hat already in his hands, and she thought, irrelevantly, that a man who habitually held his hat when approaching a house was a man with good manners that had become instinct. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. "The north pasture is through the back gate and up the slope. I'll show you." She walked with him because the fence line was complicated, running along a ridge where the land dipped and rose unpredictably, and he would not know where the gap was without guidance. She was not walking with him for any other reason. She told herself this also. The morning was cool and clear. The sky above them the particular shade of pale blue that it turned in Texas in the spring before the heat of the day settled in, and the ground was damp from a light rain that had come through in the night. The grasses smelled clean, and the wildflowers were already pushing up through the dry earth bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush in scattered bursts of color that seemed almost reckless given the general austerity of the landscape. Ezekiel walked beside her with the unhurried stride of a man comfortable in open country, and he looked at the land with an attentive eye, noting things: the condition of the remaining fence posts, the direction of the prevailing wind, the angle of the drainage that she recognized as the observations of someone who actually knew what he was doing. "How many acres?" he asked. 340, she said. But we only work about 200 of it. The rest is too rocky for grazing. He nodded. Your father ran this himself. With 2 hired hands, she said, but they left when he got sick. People don't stay where there's no certainty of wages. There was no bitterness in her voice when she said it because she had moved past bitterness on that particular point. It was simply a fact. The world was made of people managing their own survival, and she could not fault a man for that. What will you do? He asked. Not intrusively, not presumptuously. He asked it the way you might ask about the weather because it was relevant information about the landscape he was moving through. She was quiet for a moment. I don't entirely know yet, she admitted. My mother can't manage the place alone, and I won't ask Nora to do work she isn't suited for. I'm capable of running it, but I need hands. Have you thought about selling? No, she said, with a flatness that closed the topic. This land was her father's, and before him it had been worked with the labor of years and stubbornness, and she was not going to sell it because it was inconvenient. She had said no to far harder things than inconvenience. He didn't push. She appreciated that too. The gap in the fence was where she had expected it. A section where 2 posts had rotted through at the base, and the barbed wire had sagged and then pulled loose entirely, leaving a space wide enough for cattle to wander through without particular effort. She showed him the supply of spare posts and wire in the lean-to at the back of the barn, and he gathered what he needed without fuss and went to work. She meant to go back to the house and leave him to it. She had her own work to do, and plenty of it. But she found herself sitting on a nearby rock, because her body was tired in the deep-down way that follows grief, a tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the weight of the previous 2 weeks, and she sat and watched him work. He was efficient. He dug out the rotted posts cleanly, replaced them with new ones set at the right depth, and stretched the wire with the practiced ease of a man who had done it many times. He worked in silence mostly, and the silence was comfortable, which surprised her, because silence with most people was something that needed filling. After a while he said, without looking up from the wire he was stretching, "What was he like?" "Your father," she thought about it. "Difficult," she said, "and honest." He expected a great deal from everyone, including himself. He never asked anyone to do something he wasn't willing to do himself. He didn't know how to show affection the way other men did, but he showed up. For everything, every single time. Ezekiel pulled the wire taut and fastened it to the new post. "Sounds like a good man." He was, she said. He was also exhausting. He laughed at that, a short, genuine sound, and she found herself smiling before she could think about it, and that surprised her enough that she looked away toward the distant hills. He finished the fence line in 2 hours and refused payment. She argued with him about this, which she felt was only right. He held his ground, which she also felt was only right, and eventually she settled the matter by making him a midday meal before he rode to the Holden Ranch, because feeding someone was a form of payment that he would find harder to refuse than money. She made biscuits and salt pork and strong coffee, and they ate at the kitchen table while her mother listened from the next room with, Evelyn was fairly certain, very close attention. He got the job at the Holden Ranch. He told her this when he stopped by the following week to ask if there was anything else that needed doing around the Turner property, and she gave him a list because there was, and because she had decided that his help was practical and not something she needed to feel complicated about. This was how it began in practicalities. He came by twice a week, on the days he wasn't working for Bill Holden, and he fixed things. He rehung the barn door that had been listing on its hinges for months. He patched the roof of the chicken coop, where a section had started to separate. He helped Evelyn move the small herd of cattle to the south pasture where the spring grass was better, and he did it with a competence and good humor that she found incrementally, against her careful intentions, deeply appealing. They talked while he worked, and she stopped pretending she had other things to do and simply sat with him, or walked with him, or worked alongside him when there were tasks she could assist with. She learned that he had grown up in Georgia, that he had come west after the war. He had been too young to fight but old enough to see what the war had done to everything around him, and that he had been moving steadily westward for several years with no fixed destination in mind. "Don't you want a fixed destination?" she asked him once, on a warm April afternoon when they were checking the condition of the fence line on the east side of the property, and the bluebonnets were riotous along the road below them. He considered this with his characteristic thoughtfulness. "I think I was waiting to find a reason to stop," he said. She didn't ask him to elaborate, but she thought about the way he had said it for a long time afterward. The town of Dry Creek had opinions about Ezekiel Blackwell's twice-weekly visits to the Turner Ranch, because the town of Dry Creek had opinions about everything. Mrs. Hollies expressed these opinions to Clara Turner over the counter of the general store, with a directness that she presumably considered to be friendly concern. The widow Payne expressed them to Reverend Aldridge in the form of a question about the appropriateness of a young, unmarried woman spending time with an unknown man of uncertain origins. The men at the saloon expressed them in the form of jokes that Ezekiel heard and ignored, because he had learned a long time ago that the noise most people made was inversely proportional to the significance of what they had to say. Evelyn heard all of this, as she heard most things in Dry Creek, because information moved through small towns the way water moved through flat earth, quickly, and along the path of least resistance. She did not particularly care what Mrs. Hollies or the widow Payne thought, because she was 26 years old and her father had just died and she had a ranch to manage, and she was not going to spend the energy she needed for actual living on the management of other people's assumptions. She said this to her mother one evening after Clara had relayed, with careful neutrality, the substance of Mrs. Hollies's remarks. "I know," Clara said. She was sitting at the table darning stockings, her needle moving with practiced steadiness. "I'm not telling you to change anything. I'm telling you what's being said so you're not caught off guard by it. Has it occurred to you to tell Mrs. Hollies that a woman whose roof is leaking and whose fence is down can accept help from wherever it comes?" "It has occurred to me," Clara said. "I may also have said something to that effect." Evelyn looked at her mother with a small, surprised warmth. "Good." Clara was quiet for a moment, her needle still. "He's a good man, Evelyn." "He's a practical help," Evelyn said. "He is that," Clara agreed, in the gentle, measured tone of a woman choosing not to say the other things she might say. Evelyn went to bed that night and lay awake listening to the coyotes call across the dark plain, and thinking about a man who had stopped in the middle of going about his own business, because he'd seen a coffin that needed carrying, and a woman who was too proud to ask for help, but clearly needed it. She thought about the way he listened when she spoke, as if what she was saying was worth the attention he was giving it, which was not something she had large experience of. She thought about the warmth of his laugh, and the way the afternoon light sat on his hands when he worked. She turned over firmly and told herself to go to sleep. Nora, who shared the room with her and was not asleep either, said quietly into the dark, "You like him." "Good night, Nora," Evelyn said. "You like him a great deal," Nora said, with the gentle, implacable accuracy of a younger sister who has had 22 years to study you. Evelyn did not dignify this with a response, but she did not sleep for some time. May came in with warmth and a thoroughness that bleached the sky white at midday, and the cattle were settled, and the fences were holding, and Ezekiel Blackwell was still stopping by the Turner Ranch twice a week with no particular reason given beyond the ongoing list of repairs, which Evelyn was beginning to suspect she was unconsciously extending. One afternoon in the middle of May, he arrived to find her on the roof of the barn, attempting to patch a section of shingles that had lifted in a windstorm 3 days before. She was perfectly capable of roof work. She had done it before, but the particular section she was working on required reaching at an angle that put her balance at a disadvantage, and she had already nearly slipped twice, which she was aware of and managing, and which he appeared to assess from the ground in approximately 4 seconds. "Come down," he said. "I'm managing fine," she said. "You nearly went over just now." "Nearly isn't the same as actually," she said. He stood below her with his arms crossed and that quiet, stubborn patience of his, and she finished what she was doing with deliberate care to prove the point. And then she climbed down the ladder. And when she reached the bottom rung, she was close enough to him that she could see the exact shape of the concern in his face. And it was not the patronizing concern of a man who thought women were fragile. It was the straightforward concern of a person looking at another person doing something genuinely risky and not enjoying it. "I'll come up with you," he said. "You hold the shingles in place and I'll nail them. It's a two-person job." She looked at him. "All right," she said, because he was right and she was practical. They worked on the roof for an hour, side by side in the bright May warmth, passing nails and shingles and the hammer back and forth with an ease that spoke to how much time they had spent working alongside each other in the past weeks. From up on the roof, the view stretched out over the whole of the Turner property and the land beyond it, the low hills to the north, the silver thread of the river to the east, the dust of the road that led into Dry Creek shimmering in the distance. It was beautiful in the spare, uncomplicated way that wide-open country was beautiful. "I love this view," she said, without particularly intending to say anything. He looked out at it for a moment. "I can see why," he said. "You can see everything from up here. My father used to say that a man or a woman who knew their land completely was a wealthy person, regardless of what was in their pocket." He was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like he was wise." He was, when he wasn't being impossible. He smiled at that, the smile that was becoming familiar to her, the one that started in his eyes before it reached his mouth. And she was very aware, suddenly, of how close they were, the width of a shingle, perhaps, and of the warmth that was coming off him in the afternoon sun. She picked up the hammer and held it out to him, because there were 3 more nails to drive, and she needed something to do with her hands. It was Bill Holden who eventually said the thing that moved the situation forward, which was not something Evelyn would have predicted, but which, in retrospect, made a particular sense. Bill Holden was 63 years old and had been married to his wife, Margaret, for 40 of those years, and he had the relaxed candor of a man who had long since stopped caring about saying things that needed saying. He came by the Turner ranch one afternoon in late May on business related to a water use agreement that he and Thomas had held, which now needed to be renegotiated with Clara. He sat at the kitchen table and had coffee and talked through the details with Clara and Evelyn, and then, as he was pulling on his hat to leave, he said, conversationally and to no one in particular, that Blackwell is the best hand I've hired in 10 years. Good head on him. Steady. The kind of man who makes things better simply by being around. He said this looking at a point somewhere to the left of Evelyn's ear, and then he nodded to Clara and went out the door, and Evelyn heard him talking to Ezekiel in the yard as he mounted his horse, and she heard Ezekiel's low voice in response, and she stood in the kitchen with her hands around her coffee cup and felt the warmth of a feeling she had been refusing to name spread out from her chest to her fingertips. That evening, after the work was done and the sun was sinking below the hills in a spread of orange and rose that turned the dust in the air to something like gold, Ezekiel leaned against the fence at the edge of the yard and looked at the sunset with the same attentive quiet he gave everything, and Evelyn stood beside him, and they were neither of them speaking, and the silence was the comfortable kind. And she was thinking about Bill Holden's words and about 2 months of twice-weekly visits and about a man who had appeared out of nowhere on the worst morning of her year and done something quietly extraordinary without making a production of it. "Why did you really stop?" she asked. "That morning at the church." He turned to look at her. He knew what she meant. "I told you," he said, "the coffin needed carrying." "Lots of things need doing," she said. "Most people walk past them." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sunset. "My mother died when I was 12, he said. "There weren't enough men at her funeral either. I watched the Reverend and 2 boys she barely knew carry her to the grave, and I was too small to help, and I swore that if I ever saw something like that happening and I had the means to stop it, I would." She had not expected that. She felt the words settle into her, felt the weight of them, the way a grief carried for 18 years could shape a person quietly and thoroughly. "I'm sorry," she said, "about your mother." "It was a long time ago," he said. "It doesn't get shorter," she said. "The distance doesn't make it smaller." He looked at her then, and the particular quality of that look, the open, unguarded quality of it, made her breath catch. "No," he said quietly, "it doesn't." The sun slipped below the hills and the air turned blue and cool, and the first stars were coming out over the flat Texas horizon, and Evelyn Turner stood at her fence and felt something she had not permitted herself to feel in a very long time, the particular and terrifying warmth of a heart beginning, despite itself, to open. She did not act on it immediately, because she was Evelyn Turner and she did not act on things immediately. She thought about it, and considered it from various angles, and examined her own feelings with the same practical thoroughness she brought to everything. And she concluded after 2 more weeks of this process that the feeling was not going to go away if she ignored it, and that waiting for it to pass was not, in this case, a viable strategy. She also concluded that the feeling appeared to be mutual, because she was observant and he was not as opaque as he probably thought he was. And the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking had a quality to it that was not the way a man looked at someone he was simply helping. She was not the kind of woman who waited for a man to do the essential thing, particularly when she had reason to believe the man in question was willing but cautious for his own reasons that she could respect. So on a Thursday evening in early June, when the heat of the day had finally relented and they were sitting on the porch after supper, Clara had taken to inviting him for supper on the evenings he stayed late, and he had taken to accepting. She simply said, "I'd like to know what you intend." He looked at her. He had a stillness about him when he was surprised, like an animal that has heard something unexpected and gone motionless to consider it. "Evelyn," he said. "I'm not being forward for the sake of it," she said. "I'm being practical. I don't know what this is or what it's going toward, and I prefer to know things." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the mockingbird in the cottonwood tree at the corner of the yard cycled through 3 full sequences of imitations. Then he said, "I think you know what I intend." "Tell me anyway," she said. He turned on the porch step so he was facing her fully, and in the fading light his eyes were very dark and very steady. "I intend to stay," he said, "if you'll have me near." She considered this. "Near," she repeated. I mean in whatever way you're willing," he said, and she heard, for the first time, something that was not entirely steady in his voice, something that told her he was not as unaffected by this conversation as his posture suggested. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean, and I don't want to get ahead of what you want. But I think about this place. I think about you, more than is comfortable if I'm honest." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening yard. "I think about you too," she said. "I find it considerably irritating." He laughed, the short, genuine laugh that she had been cataloging privately. "Why irritating?" "Because I'd made up my mind to be content without this particular complication," she said. "I had a plan. The ranch, my family, steady work. I didn't have room in the plan for—" She gestured vaguely, indicating him, indicating the feeling, indicating all of it. "And now," he said. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with that open, patient attention, and she thought about the morning of her father's funeral and the empty road, and the single set of boots on the dry earth behind her, and the way she had turned and found something she had not been looking for. "I may need to revise the plan," she said. He reached out and took her hand carefully, the way you might handle something you weren't sure yet if you had permission to touch, and she let him, and his hand was warm and calloused and steady, and she held it, and they sat on the porch in the blue evening and listened to the mockingbird and didn't say anything else for a while, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying just yet. Clara Turner, visible through the kitchen window where she was washing the supper dishes, did not look out at the porch. But she was smiling, and if she moved a little more quietly than usual so as not to interrupt whatever was happening outside, that was her own private business. June passed in a warmth that was both meteorological and of another kind entirely, and the Turner Ranch settled into a different rhythm, one that included Ezekiel Blackwell as a consistent and increasingly central presence. He continued to work for Bill Holden during the week, but he spent his evenings and his free days at the Turner property, and somewhere along the way this stopped being about repairs and started being about the simple pleasure of being in a particular place with a particular person. He and Evelyn took to riding out in the evenings when the day's work was done, taking the horses along the ridge road that overlooked the river, where the cottonwoods made a green line along the water, and the deer came down to drink as the sun went down. They talked on these rides about everything, about nothing, about the nature of the land and the lives of the people on it, about what they wanted and what they feared, about the past and the possible future. Evelyn discovered that he was funny, in a dry, observational way that suited her own sense of humor exactly. He discovered that she was far more openly affectionate when she was not thinking about being composed, which happened more and more often the more comfortable she became. He kissed her for the first time on one of these evening rides, in a moment that was not entirely planned but that felt, afterward, like it had been inevitable from the beginning. They had stopped the horses at a point along the ridge where the view was particularly good, and the sun was going down behind the hills in that spectacular Texas way, and she had been saying something about the cattle and the south pasture, and she had turned to find him watching her with an expression she had come to recognize but still found slightly disorienting in its directness. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're very—" and then he stopped and leaned forward from his saddle and kissed her, gentle and careful and brief, and then straightened up and looked at her with a steadiness that was, she thought, a remarkable thing to achieve in a man who had just kissed someone for the first time. She looked at him. "You were saying," she said. "You're very difficult to not look at," he said. She considered this for a moment. "That is either a compliment or a complaint," she said. "It's the truth," he said. "Take it however you like." She took it privately as the best thing anyone had said to her in a considerable time. They were careful, because the town was watching, and because they were both people who took things seriously and didn't move faster than the ground beneath them could support. But the town, which had formed its opinions quickly, also moved on to other things to talk about once it became apparent that Ezekiel Blackwell was an honest man with steady employment and no apparent vices beyond the occasional poker game at the saloon, which he played moderately, and won with enough frequency to be suspicious, but not enough to cause real trouble. Reverend Aldridge told Evelyn, when she came to speak with him about a separate church matter, that he thought Mr. Blackwell was a fine addition to their congregation, which Evelyn received with a straight face and a private amusement, since Ezekiel's attendance at church had been, she suspected, influenced at least partially by the fact that she attended, and she found this endearing rather than cynical. It was July, hot and uncompromising, when the question of the ranch's future became urgent in a way that couldn't be set aside any longer. The cattle were healthy and the fences were sound, but running the operation required consistent physical labor that Clara and Evelyn and Nora could not adequately provide, and hiring the needed hands required money they did not have in the sufficient quantities, and the bank in Dry Creek held a small lien on the property from a loan Thomas had taken out 2 years before for the purchase of additional stock. The payment on that loan was due in the autumn, and the amount was not large, but it was not nothing either. Evelyn had been managing this knowledge quietly for weeks, turning it over in her mind the way you turn a problem that doesn't have a comfortable answer. She had not mentioned it to Ezekiel because it was her family's difficulty and not his, and she was still the kind of woman who solved her own problems first before looking for assistance. But one evening in early July, when they were sitting on the porch after supper and the cicadas were in full performance in the dark beyond the yard, he said without preamble, "Tell me about the bank loan." She went still. "How did you know about that?" "Bill Holden mentioned it," he said, not in a gossipy way. He was saying he thought the Turner Ranch was a solid operation and it would be a shame to see it forced under by bad timing. She was quiet for a moment, the pride in her chest tightening. "It's manageable," she said. "Is it?" She was honest with him, because dishonesty required energy she didn't have, and because she had found, to her own mild amazement, that she trusted him with the real state of things. She told him about the loan and the payment due and the shortfall and what they could reasonably expect to bring in before autumn. She said it plainly, without drama, because it was a practical problem and she was a practical person. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I have money saved, from the drives and from working for Holden. I'm not rich, but I have enough to cover that payment and then some." She shook her head immediately. "No, Evelyn." "No," she said again firmly. "I won't take your savings. That money is yours and it's your security." "I know that," he said. "That's why I'm offering it, because it matters what it goes toward." She looked at him, and there was something in the open simplicity of what he'd said that made the tight thing in her chest loosen slightly, not because she intended to take the money, but because the offer itself it was something. It was the kind of thing a person offered when they were thinking about a future that included you in it, and she was aware of that, and she let herself be aware of it for a moment before she gathered herself back to practicality. "We'll find another way," she said. "All right," he said. He didn't argue further, which she also appreciated. He had made his offer and accepted her answer, which was the behavior of a man who respected her enough to let her make her own decisions even when he thought she was being stubborn, which she was. She knew she was. They found, ultimately, a solution that involved neither taking his savings nor losing the ranch. Bill Holden, who turned out to be more interested in the welfare of the Turner property than his casual demeanor suggested, offered to buy a portion of Turner grazing rights for 2 seasons. A fair price, not charity, which gave Clara sufficient funds to cover the bank payment with a modest amount remaining. Clara negotiated this herself in Bill Holden's kitchen with a thoroughness that impressed both Holden and Evelyn, and came home with the paperwork signed and a look of quiet satisfaction. "Your mother," Ezekiel said to Evelyn that evening with genuine admiration, "is formidable." "She had to become it," Evelyn said. "My father was the visible force of things. She was the structure underneath." He thought about this. "Every good thing needs both," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "it does." In August, Ezekiel sat down with Evelyn on the porch one evening and said, with the particular stillness that meant he was saying something he had been working up to, "I'd like to speak with you about something." She put down the mending she was doing. "Go ahead." He turned his hat in his hands, the hat in hands habit that she had first noticed at the cemetery and had long since assigned its proper meaning, which was that he was approaching something with care and respect. "I've been thinking about what I want," he said. "And what I want is to stay here, not just at the Holden Ranch, here in Dry Creek, with your family, with you." He paused. "I'd like to ask your mother's permission to court you formally, and I'd like to know before I do that if you're of a mind to be courted, formally." Evelyn looked at this man who had appeared at the worst moment of her year and had steadily, quietly, without making it about himself, made everything better. She looked at the seriousness in his face and the patience in his eyes and the hat turning in his hands. "You've been courting me for 3 months," she said. "Informally," he said. "I'd like to do it properly." She felt the warmth spread through her the way it did now, reliably, when she stopped arguing with herself. "Yes," she said. "Ask her." He asked Clara that same evening after supper, standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and his back straight, and the full, earnest attention he gave everything concentrated entirely on what he was saying. Clara listened to him. She asked him 2 questions about his finances and his intentions, and received direct answers to both. And then she said yes, because she had known what she thought of Ezekiel Blackwell since the afternoon he had sat at her table and eaten his food with quiet gratitude and asked nothing of any of them. Nora, who had been listening from the hallway with absolutely no pretense of subtlety, made a small delighted sound that she covered, imperfectly, with a cough. The formal courtship was, in practice, not enormously different from what had been happening for months, except that there was a clarity to it now that Evelyn found she had wanted without quite knowing it. Things had names. Things had intentions. The future had a shape, and she could look at the shape and find it good. He asked her to marry him in September, when the heat had broken and the evenings were cool, and the cottonwoods along the river had turned a clear, ringing gold. He did it on the ridge road where they had first kissed in the late afternoon light, with the directness that was the through line of everything he did. He said, "I love you, Evelyn. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you said, 'Nevertheless, I am thanking you' at the cemetery, because it was the most stubbornly gracious thing I'd ever heard. I want to spend my life on this land with your family, and I want to do it with you. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment. The golden light sat on his face, and the cottonwoods shivered in the breeze, and the river glinted silver below them. And she thought about all the things she had told herself in the past months about plans and complications and the danger of wanting things, and she let all of that go. "Yes," she said, "I will." He let out a breath that told her he had not been entirely certain, despite everything, and she loved him for that uncertainty, for the fact that he had not assumed, had not taken anything for granted, and she reached up and took his face in both her hands and kissed him the way she had been wanting to for some time. They were married in October, in the little church with the leaning steeple, on a morning when the air smelled of wood smoke and turning leaves, and the particular crispness that Texas managed for exactly 6 weeks a year before the cold came down from the north. The Reverend presided with the particular satisfaction of a man who approved of the proceedings. Clara cried, quietly and completely, in the front pew. Nora stood up beside Evelyn and held the small bouquet of late wildflowers that she had gathered herself that morning, and her eyes were bright, and her expression was the one she wore when she was experiencing a feeling too large for her usual capacity. Bill Holden and his wife Margaret sat in the third row, and Margaret Holden cried also, though she denied this afterward with great conviction. Ezekiel stood at the front of the church in his best clothes, which he had supplemented with a new shirt and a pressed jacket, and when Evelyn came down the aisle on her own, because her father was gone and she was Evelyn Turner, who did things herself, he watched her with the open, unguarded expression that was just his, and she met his eyes, and the tightness in her chest was not grief, and not pride this time, but something altogether different and far more welcome. They said their vows without stumbling. He put a simple gold ring on her finger that he had purchased from the jeweler in the next town over, riding out specifically for this purpose on his day off, and he held her hand with both of his after he'd placed it there, as if setting something down carefully in its proper place. Afterward, the church ladies had organized a supper in the adjoining hall that would have been more than adequate for twice the number of people present, and there was music, a fiddle player and a man with a harmonica, and the kind of evening that small towns are actually very good at when the occasion is right. People danced on the plank floor, and Ezekiel held Evelyn with a confidence that surprised her pleasantly because she had not known he could dance. "Where did you learn?" she asked as they moved together through the pattern of a reel. "A girl in San Antonio taught me," he said. "She was a very patient teacher." "I see," Evelyn said. "Should I be concerned about this very patient teacher?" "She married a banker 3 years ago," he said. "I believe they're very happy." "Good," Evelyn said. And she was, genuinely, because it meant there was no one to be concerned about, and also because she found she could afford to be generous on this particular evening. They moved into the Turner house that night, because it made practical sense, and because Clara had insisted, and because the house was large enough that the addition of one more person didn't create any real crowding, and because none of them, not Evelyn, not Clara, not Nora, wanted to manage the place with fewer hands than they had. Ezekiel settled into the household with the same natural ease he brought to everything. He was up before the others in the mornings, starting the fire and drawing water, and he fell into the rhythms of the place without disrupting them, adapting where adaptation was needed and contributing where contribution was welcome. He and Clara developed a quiet, warm rapport. She gave him his coffee exactly the way he liked it, and he fixed things around the house without being asked. And they had conversations in the kitchen in the early mornings, while Evelyn was still working through the slower process of becoming fully human before her first cup. He continued working for Bill Holden for part of each week, which gave them steady income while they worked to build up the Turner operation, and over the course of the following year, with the addition of his labor and his savings, which Evelyn agreed, now that they were married, was no longer a question of charity. They rebuilt the herd to 30 head and brought on one hired hand, a quiet young man of 19 named Caleb who was strong and willing and learned quickly. Nora, who had been quiet for most of the preceding events in the way of a person absorbing a great deal, made an announcement in December that she had been corresponding with a schoolteacher in a town 30 miles east, a man named Arthur Vance, whom she had met briefly the previous year when he had come through Dry Creek visiting family. She showed Clara and Evelyn the letters with a combination of defiance and hope that was so thoroughly Nora that both women found themselves trying not to smile. "He's a good writer," Evelyn said, reading through the most recent letter with a focus that Nora found probably excessive. "He's a good man," Nora said. "How do you know from letters?" Evelyn said. "The same way you knew about Ezekiel from watching him fix a fence," Nora said with dignity. Evelyn looked up. She opened her mouth. She closed it. "Fair," she said. "Arthur Vance came to Dry Creek to call in February, and he was indeed a good man, mild and earnest, with an unexpectedly sharp wit and a genuine warmth for Nora that was evident in the way he listened when she spoke, which Evelyn recognized immediately as a sign worth paying attention to. He sat at the Turner kitchen table and had coffee and talked with Clara and Evelyn, and Ezekiel with the transparent nervousness of a man trying very hard to make a good impression, which he did, through the simple mechanism of being honest and unpretentious. Ezekiel told Evelyn privately that he liked him. Evelyn said she did too, which was a considerable endorsement from her, and Nora received this information with a relief so intense that she had to leave the room briefly to collect herself. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a hard one, which was not unusual for western Texas. They managed it. They had enough food preserved, enough wood stocked, enough hands to share the necessary work. On the worst nights, when the wind came down from the north with a seriousness that made the walls of the house flex, they sat together around the fire, the four of them, and played cards or read or simply sat in companionable quiet. And Evelyn looked across the fire at her husband and felt the particular, profound satisfaction of a life that was genuinely good. She told him this one night when they were alone, in the soft dark of their room, with the wind still going outside and the fire banked low. "I want you to know," she said, "that I'm happy. Genuinely, I don't think I was sure I knew what that felt like before." He was quiet for a moment beside her and she could feel the warmth of him. "I wasn't sure I knew either," he said. "I think I'd been moving for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to want to stop. And now," she said. "Now," he said, and she could hear the smile in it, "I can't imagine why I'd move." She reached for his hand in the dark and held it, and outside the wind sang against the eaves, and inside it was warm. Spring came back with its usual sudden decision, and with it, confirmation of something Evelyn had suspected for several weeks but had been holding quietly to herself. She told him on a Tuesday morning, when Clara and Nora had gone to town for supplies and the house was their own, sitting across the kitchen table with her hands around her coffee cup and her face composed with the effort of not showing everything she was feeling. "I'm expecting," she said. He went very still, the way he did when something surprised him completely. She watched his face move through 3 expressions in the space of 2 seconds: surprise, something deep and wondering, and then an opening warmth that she had no name for but that she felt in her own chest like a struck bell. He stood up from his chair and came around the table to her and took her hands from the coffee cup and held them, and he looked at her with everything he was showing in his face without any of the careful management that both of them usually applied to the showing of themselves. "Are you well?" he said. "Perfectly," she said, which was not quite accurate. She had been considerably nauseated for 2 weeks, but was true in the meaningful sense. "Evelyn," he said, and then he didn't say anything else, because apparently he didn't have words adequate to the moment, which she found, from a man who habitually chose his words with such care, entirely sufficient. She stood up and he put his arms around her and she rested her head against his chest, which was something she had discovered she loved to do, because it was warm and steady and felt like the physical form of every reliable thing he was. "We're going to need to add a room," she said, into his shirt. He laughed, the genuine laugh, and held her tighter. "I'll start on it next week," he said. Clara Turner, when she came home from town that afternoon and was told the news, sat down in her chair and cried in the open, uncomplicated way that she had not done since the funeral, but these were different tears, and everyone present understood the difference perfectly. The pregnancy was, on the whole, uneventful, which was, as any woman of that era understood, the best possible thing it could be. Evelyn continued to work, because she was Evelyn and work was what she did, though she submitted to a renegotiation of its terms around the 6th month, when Ezekiel and Clara and even Nora presented a united front that she found impossible to argue with on purely rational grounds. She did less of the heavy physical work and more of the management and planning, which suited the ranch well, as it was growing and needed more of both. Ezekiel built the room as he had said he would, a proper bedroom addition off the back of the house, framed and roofed and floored with a care that you could see in every joint. Caleb helped with the heavier work, and Bill Holden sent over 2 of his men for the 3 days that the roof framing required, which he did without being asked, and without making anything of it, which was the Holden way. Their son was born in the last week of November 1879, delivered by the midwife, Mrs. Pryor, in the room that now smelled of fresh-cut wood and the lavender that Clara had hung in a bundle from the rafters. He was a healthy boy with dark hair and his mother's eyes, and he announced his own arrival with an energy and volume that carried clearly through the house and out into the cold November morning. Ezekiel held him with the careful, awed attention of a man holding something he could not quite believe was real, and his hands, those calloused, capable, steady hands, held the baby as gently as they had held anything he had ever handled. "What shall we call him?" Evelyn said, from the bed, tired and bright-eyed. "Thomas," he said without hesitating. "If you're willing." She looked at him. She felt the warmth of that move through her, the recognition of the gesture, what it meant, the honoring of a man who had not always been easy to love but who had deserved to be remembered. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." They named him Thomas Ezekiel Blackwell, and Clara, when Ezekiel carried the baby out to show her, took him with the careful confidence of a grandmother who knew what she was doing and looked at the small face for a long moment before she said, in a voice that was perfectly steady, "Hello, Thomas." Caleb came to the door with his hat in his hands, a gesture Evelyn noticed with a private warmth, and looked at the baby with the expression of a 19-year-old who is finding unexpected feelings in himself and isn't entirely sure what to do about them. December brought Nora's news, which was not entirely surprising but was occasion for a celebration regardless. Arthur Vance had asked her to marry him, by letter, which Nora presented with the specific combination of triumph and embarrassment that was her mode, and which Clara accepted with the practical immediacy of a woman who had a second daughter to see settled and intended to see it done properly. Arthur came to Dry Creek again in the new year, 1880, and this time he came with clear purpose, and they were married in March, a smaller, quieter ceremony than Evelyn and Ezekiel's, in the same little church. Nora wore Clara's wedding dress, taken in at the waist and let out at the shoulders, and she was incandescent in it, and Arthur looked at her with a devotion that settled Evelyn's lingering protective concern completely. Nora moved to Arthur's town, which was only 30 miles away, close enough for regular visits, far enough to be her own household. and the parting, which Evelyn had dreaded slightly, was made bearable by the obviousness of Nora's happiness, which was the only thing that had ever truly been required. With Nora gone, the house held 4 people: Ezekiel and Evelyn, Clara and small Thomas, who at 3 months was already demonstrating a personality of considerable determination, and was demonstrating it at volume, particularly between 2 and 4 in the morning. He had his father's eyes after all, the dark, steady ones, and his mother's jaw, which presaged a future of being very hard to argue with. The ranch continued to grow. By the summer of 1880, they had 45 head of cattle and a reputation in the surrounding area for reliable stock, which brought buyers to them rather than requiring the costly and labor-intensive process of driving to market. Ezekiel negotiated these transactions with a quiet shrewdness that surprised the buyers, who expected a young rancher to be eager and therefore cheap, and who found instead a man who knew the value of what he was selling and was not in a hurry. He had formally left the Holden employ the previous winter, which Bill Holden had accepted with good grace and a handshake, and a standing invitation to call on him for assistance in any circumstance, which had already been honored twice, and which Ezekiel intended to honor in return when the occasion arose. They had a second child in the autumn of 1881, a daughter this time, dark-haired and startlingly blue-eyed, a combination that appeared from nowhere and that everyone found inexplicably delightful. They named her Clara Rose, for her grandmother, and Clara Turner held her namesake in the kitchen rocking chair that had been Thomas Sr.'s chair before it became Clara's, and rocked her in the afternoon light while the older Thomas, who at 2 was already ambitious and frequently in places, he was not supposed to be sat on the floor beside them with one of his father's old boot brushes, which he had appropriated for purposes known only to himself. Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her mother and her children and the light coming through the window, and she felt a completeness that she had not had words for when she was younger, and that she had no words for now either, but that did not require words to be entirely real. Ezekiel came in from the yard and stood beside her, and she leaned into him without thinking about it, because she always did now, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together in the doorway and watched the afternoon scene in the kitchen. "Are you happy?" she asked him, because she had gotten into the habit of asking, not because she doubted but because she valued the answer. "Yes," he said, with the directness that was the consistent truth of him. "More than I knew was possible." She turned to look at him. He looked back with the open, steady gaze that still had the power to make her feel, after everything, the warmth of a heart that had opened despite its best intentions, and found the opening worth every complicated thing it had taken to get there. "Good," she said, and she kissed him there in the doorway, with the sound of her mother's rocking chair and her son's earnest boot-brushing activity, and her daughter's small, contented sounds coming from the kitchen, and the warm Texas afternoon spreading golden and unhurried outside, and the mockingbird in the cottonwood tree starting up its endless, joyful repetitions. The years that followed were full years. Thomas grew into a serious, capable boy who had his father's patient observation and his mother's stubborn practicality, and who by the age of 6 was already learning the work of the ranch, with a focus that made Ezekiel quietly proud and Evelyn simultaneously proud and amused. Clara Rose was her opposite in temperament, quick and social and charming, with an ability to get what she wanted from absolutely everyone around her that her grandmother found entirely natural, and her parents found both impressive and occasionally exhausting. Nora and Arthur came for visits with their own children, a son in 1882 and twin daughters in 1884, which Nora handled with a composure that impressed everyone and an occasional expression of stunned bewilderment that she directed mainly at Arthur. They were happy, with the particular happiness of 2 people who suit each other in ways that go beyond the obvious, and seeing Nora in her own household, settled and warm and quietly thriving, was one of the ongoing pleasures of Evelyn's life. Clara Turner remained in the house on the ranch, and this was right, and everyone knew it. She had built her life into this land as surely as her husband had, and it was hers as much as anyone's, and she was not the kind of woman who faded with age. She was sharper in some ways and more comfortable in others, and she had the contentment of a woman surrounded by people she loved who were doing well. Ezekiel built a new barn in 1882, a proper one, larger and better constructed than the original, and when he was done he stood back and looked at it in the early evening with the particular satisfaction of a man looking at something he has built well. Evelyn stood beside him. "We've come a long way," she said, looking at the barn and the house and the fenced pastures and the cattle moving in the late light. "We have," he said. "From a leaning fence post and a cracked roof," she said. "From a coffin that needed carrying," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her with a steadiness that still, after years of looking, had the quality of something she wanted to go on looking at. "That is where it started," she said. "That is exactly where it started," he said. He reached out and took her hand, the same way he had taken it the first time on the porch, carefully, as if it were something he was grateful to be permitted to hold. "And I intend for it to go on for a very long time." She looked at the hand holding hers, calloused, capable, steady, and at the barn and the house and the land that had been her father's and was now theirs, and at the evening sky above it, all that was turning through its familiar sequence from gold to rose to the deep luminous blue of a Texas dusk. "So do I," she said. They stood at the fence at the end of the day, the way they had stood at so many fences in so many evenings, watching the light change over the land they had built together, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that has nothing to prove and everything to settle into. And the mockingbird started up somewhere in the cottonwoods, and the first stars appeared. And Thomas Ezekiel Blackwell, the younger, came running from the direction of the house with his boots on the wrong feet, and something important he needed to tell his father. And Clara Rose was calling after him to wait for her. And inside the house Clara Turner was beginning supper, and the smell of it was drifting out on the evening air, and the land stretched out in every direction, wide and open and full. And Evelyn Turner Blackwell held her husband's hand in the gathering dark and felt, with the whole of herself, that this was exactly the life she was meant to be living, and that it had begun, as the best things so often do, with a single unremarkable act of decency on a hard morning. A man in a battered hat who had seen a coffin that needed carrying and a woman who needed help she was too proud to ask for, and had simply stepped forward. Nothing more than that, and nothing less. And from that one moment, quietly and persistently and with a great deal of stubbornness on both sides, an entire life had grown.